Okay, this is the fourth video that I am making on behalf of my father, Starling Mack, and the story that he obtained from Richard Hickok in the spring to early fall of 1961. Concerning his life story, and primarily what we're focusing on is the account that he gave to my father about the Clutter murders that happened back there in November 14th, 1959. Before I go on with the account, I would like to stop for a couple of minutes, and some people that are watching this, if they are watching it without having any knowledge of Richard Hickok or Perry Smith or the Clutter family or Garden City, Kansas, or what happened out there at the farm that fall night, I would like to stop for a little while and just interject some facts, documentation that I found when I went up to Topeka, Kansas in the fall, November of 2012, and went through the Hickok Smith Kansas State Penitentiary files that were there at the Kansas State Historical Society. Okay, this is important for people to understand that Richard Hickok had given certain statements concerning his plan for parole to the Kansas State prison officials. At that time, a person had to have a place to live and a job on the outside before they could be recommended for parole. And in 1958, Richard Hickok, in November 10th of 1958, he filled out a document that was submitted with his request to be paroled. That would be, let's see, February 6, 1959 is when he was asking for the parole board to see him regarding this issue. He said, "I am going to farm with my father. He is going to buy some more land or rent so that I may be able to do so. I have 3 boys who I will definitely take care of financially. My wife is married again. I have been married twice, but I don't want anything to do with my second wife. I can and will live down my parole." And the farm is up there in Edgerton, Kansas. Little bitty, I think 40-acre farm that his dad had, and his mother lived there too, and he was going to go back home and help them take care of this farm, and then he would help to support himself and his parents and his kids that he had, and also pay off the creditors that he had written the hot checks against that originally put him in the prison there in Lansing on the original charge. This is in April 23rd, 1959, handwritten by Richard Eugene Hickok, and it's an application for clemency. The parole board did not grant him parole in February. And Dick Hickok is trying to send this to the governor of Kansas, who would have been George Docking at that time. In this letter, he goes on about, I have this younger brother there at the farm, and my parents are there at the farm, and that I found out that my dad, this is Hickok talking, has cancer. And I need to ask you if you would grant me executive clemency in order for me to go back home and be available to help support my mom and dad and my children and pay off my creditors and live as a respectable citizen in the community. Okay, so he applied for executive clemency and it was denied. June 1st, 1959. This is the second parole plan drafted by Hickok and submitted to the authorities there at KSP and the parole board. My father is going to be unemployed and won't be able to farm. My plans are this: to live with my folks and do the farming of my people's farm. I feel that it is a good way to live down my parole, also to be able to support my children financially. Okay, so basically over the year between 58 and 59, Dick Hickok hasn't really changed much of his story about what he plans on doing, where he's going to live, and how he's going to make a living, and his intentions after being paroled, if he gets the parole that he did do a little bit later in August of 1959. He was released from the Kansas State Penitentiary. Okay, saying that, it's important to know what was in the mind of Dick Hickok prior to being released from prison as far as his intent. And here along July of 1959, Perry Smith was released from the Kansas State Penitentiary on a conditional release and paroled back out west to where his father lived. Now, in the pages of In Cold Blood by Truman Capote, portrays Perry Smith's dad as this real abusive, basically insane father figure, and that may very well have been. But at the same time, inside Perry Smith's file of KSP are many letters written from Tex Smith, his dad, to the warden at Kansas State Penitentiary, expressing concern about his son, who is doing time up there for burglary on the original charge, and that he would like to sponsor him and he could give him a place to live, and also they could work together and it would be a benefit to both of them if he would be allowed to be paroled back out there to Nevada, where Tex Smith was located at the moment. Now, he was a rather nomadic type of a person, lived in a pickup truck, and had a self-made apartment on the back of the pickup, including a stove and a place to lay down and sleep. And that's how Tex Smith lived. He was a prospector and a man who did odd jobs and never lived in one spot very long, and that's kind of how Perry Smith grew up with his dad too. Never really having a home and not really having a chance as a child to have very much security. I'm thinking that that's probably the accurate portrayal of Perry Smith as a kid. Okay, so Perry Smith, his parole out there in July of 1959 was to go home, and his plans were to go back out west and live with his dad, help his dad, work with his dad, and become adjusted to society and be a law-abiding citizen. Now this is what's going on in the summertime of 1959, and it's important to know that because right after Perry Smith moved out of the same cell as Richard Hickok up there at Kansas State Penitentiary in July of 1959, Dick Hickok was in that cell alone afterwards, and he was rather happy about that because he didn't have very much time to go before he was going to be paroled out also. And in prison, you know, space is rather limited, and it can be very cumbersome to have roommates, and especially if you don't get along with that roommate. One day, Dick Hickok came back in from working in the tag shop. He made automobile tags for the state of Kansas at, I think, 20 cents a day. And anyway, he came back to his cell, and in his cell was a guy with a baby face sitting on the bunk, and Dick Hickok came in and said, "Well, who are you?" And this guy told him, "I'm Floyd Wells." And so this was going to be Hickok's new cellmate, and the two of them began to talk. There is no television or any type of entertainment, if you will, inside the penitentiary at that time. You could read the newspaper or somebody sent you some mail, but other than that, there really wasn't anything else to do but talk and sleep and do your time. And the men began to talk, and Floyd Wells told him what he'd done and why he was in there, and Hickok was, you know, had been in there for a couple, 2.5 years or something like that, so he was real familiar with prison and how things worked, and this guy was kind of the new fish. And Floyd Wells brought up this family that he had worked for out here in western Kansas, who he claimed was a rich farmer that had a safe inside the house of his farm there with his family down on the first floor in an office that he had seen and that he knew for sure had $10,000 at any given time, if not more, in cash in the safe. It wasn't just that he thought he knew about the safe. He told Dick Hickok that he had seen this safe anchored into the wall of the office of Herb Clutter when remodeling was going on in the house. He saw it firsthand. And he also saw this money, this large amount of cash. He saw that because he saw Mr. Clutter pay these farmhands out there at harvest time in the summer their wages with cash money that he retrieved from his own personal safe in this office. This is what Dick Hickok told my father in these letters that are up there at the Kansas State Historical Society now. And this is a story that Hickok relayed to my father. Now, you're not going to find that story in Cold Blood. That isn't the story that Truman Capote told people. He just said that there was information that Hickok and Smith knew about, and were told that there was some type of a safe or something out there, and this family had this money, or probably had this money, or was supposed to have this money, but it wasn't a certainty. And Truman Capote went on to say, oh, these guys just went out there on the assumption or presumption that this money would be there when they arrived. That isn't the story that Dick Hickok told my father. He said there was a safe, that he had seen it installed in the office, and the certainty that the amount of money was at least $10,000 cash, if not more, was ironclad. He also told Dick Hickok, before he revealed all that to him, that he wouldn't tell him all about the Clutters without first having Hickok promise to give him a share of this money if they went out there, him and Perry Smith, or whoever he took out there with him, to pull this job. And according to Hickok, what he told my father was the two of them made this agreement inside that cell while they were together, and then they began to go further into detail about diagrams of the entire farm, of where the hired hands residence was, how far away was that from the farmhouse, was there anything else out there, and very, very detailed account about the inside of the Clutter house, from the basement all the way to the second floor, each room, where it was located, who slept where, and how many people were in the house, etc., etc., etc. This story was told by Floyd Wells, according to Dick Hickok, in the story he told my dad, over and over and over. And he had maps and diagrams, and he had never been to Garden City, and Hickok said, and how do we get out there, and how do we find this farm, and it's about 7 miles from Garden City out there, and it's in the country, and it's going to be dark, so how do we get there? All of that was prearranged by and provided by this guy named Floyd Wells. Now, when he testified as the star witness of the state of Kansas at the trial of Perry Smith and Dick Hickok back in March of 1960, that isn't what he told the court or the jury. He said he thought that there was some type of a safe or something like that, and that it probably had a lot of money in it, but it wasn't the same story that he had told Hickok over and over and over, and convinced him that this existed out there. So there's a lot of things about Floyd Wells. You know, he waited several weeks or something to report this to the assistant warden at KSP, this story that he knew who had committed this terrible crime out there at the Clutter farm, and identified Hickok and Smith to the KBI and prison officials, and just real odd stuff. Okay? This guy tells them all this, and then he ends up collecting this $1,000 reward, and was the star witness out there for Garden City in the prosecution of Smith and Hickok. Basically got them convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder, and he's the one that told them all this and made this bargain with Hickok to be paid out of the monies that they were going to take out of this safe. But none of that came out of the trial, and none of that's in the book, being cold blood, and it's about time that people know that that was a part of this mix. Now, I'm going to go back to May of 1961, and I told you earlier that on May 7th, 1961, Dick Hickok and Mack Nation signed a agreement, a legal contract for the writing of Dick Hickok's life story, and that Dale Corley out in Garden City, Kansas, the first appeal attorney for Dick Hickok, was the one that originated that legal instrument between those two men. I want to read something to you. This is dated May 14th, 1961, Office of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. It's sent by Alvin Dewey to Truman Capote. If you remember what I told you earlier by that quote that I quoted, that Truman Capote and his wife told everybody until their deaths that nobody, neither one of them, especially Alvin Dewey, had ever helped Truman Capote in gaining any advantage or offering any inside information concerning the Clutter murder case. And I just want you to listen to this. This is after the trial. The two of the killers are already up there in Lansing serving death row sentences for the 4 murders of the Clutter family members. It says down here in the 5th paragraph of this letter to Truman Capote, I understand that a writer for the Wichita Eagle newspaper, who has been writing a series of articles in regard to inmates on death row at the KSP, is going to do some articles on Hickok and has hopes of selling them to a magazine. From what I can learn, Hickok is doing the writing, and this guy will dress it up. We'll send it to you if it is ever published. Now, this is in May of 1961, right after Dick Hickok and Mack Nations signed this contract. Let's see here, what would that be? 7 days earlier. Okay, if you believe in coincidence, I don't, so I'll leave it to speak for itself. This is a copy of the actual letter that I still have from Richard Hickok to Mack Nations. I have the original, but this is a copy of it, dated June 19th, 1961, Lansing, Kansas, in this incredible penmanship by Richard Hickok. Dear Mr. Nations, just received your letter in regard to a contract change. I believe I informed you before that I would be perfectly willing to agree to an arrangement on a 50-50 basis. I realize that your expenses will be considerable in the event of your traveling to New York City. I agree that the most expeditious method of selling the book would be a personal appearance before the publisher and a oral sales talk is by far superior to one by mail. Time is a very important factor as far as my future benefit is concerned. And I also am aware that this could possibly be a hindrance in our obtaining the maximum sales price for the material. Okay, a couple of things that I want to say about this particular original letter, even though this is a copy of it. The KBI is aware of Mack Nations obtaining this information from Richard Hickok early in the summer in May of 1961. Prison officials up there at Lansing are very, very aware. They're the ones that permitted my father to go in there, even though there is no record, absolute no trace of Mack Nations ever going into Lansing, Kansas at the KSP to visit Richard Hickok during the calendar year 1961. It's absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. And this is a very big point that I want to make right now, is why was that? And why was all this going on? And why were people in the state government of Kansas involved with Truman Capote, like Alvin Dewey, like Charles McAtee, that I'll show you later on, who was the pardon attorney for the state of Kansas. He was in the State House building, in the same building as the governor of Kansas. The reason I happen to know that is my father worked in that building as executive secretary to Governor Fred Hall in the calendar year 1955. I will read something that I found that is an original draft page taken from my father's book, High Road to Hell. My father typed this. I was taken to the top floor of the courthouse where the jail was located and looked in a cell away from the rest of the prisoners. I didn't know what to expect from the crowd outside. I had heard of incidents where men were taken from a jail and hung to the closest tree. But the night proved uneventful as far as we were concerned. But I decided to wait a while and see what developed. I had a visit by my dad and brother. I had been at Garden City about 2 or 3 weeks when they came to see me. One of the first questions my dad asked me was if I was paid for it. I told him no, that it wasn't anything like that. He then proceeded to tell me how he had been questioned as to the possibility of me having any large sum of money. He told me how 3 different men had asked him the same thing. You're not going to find that in cold blood. Why not? And these law enforcement people, KBI agents, that were investigating this crime and went out there to the farmhouse at Eugene, Kansas to talk with Mr. and Mrs. Hickok about this case and where their son was, and that this shotgun belonged to their son Dick, and all these other questions, especially these, about did you notice if Richard Hickok had any extra money or appeared to be spending any extra money before he left the state of Kansas to flee. And Mr. and Mrs. Hickok told the law enforcement officials that they weren't aware of any money, extra monies. But see, why would the police be asking those questions unless there was evidence to suggest that he did? Okay? Remember that Richard Hickok and Perry Smith both told a clemency board of the state of Kansas 1 week prior to them being hung on April 14th, 1965. This was separately. They weren't in the room at the same time. Dick Hickok told them that when they left the Clutter house that night, they left with over $1,000 cash. That isn't in cold blood. Why not? Perry Smith came in and told that committee a week before they were going to hang him, and both of them knew they weren't going to get clemency. Both of them had already decided that this was their fate, but they told this committee, or Perry Smith told them, that, hey, this guy Floyd Wells, just thought I would tell you, but he was supposed to get $1,000 to $2,000 of our cut of that SACE money that night. Now, why would he tell them that? I mean, if you already know that you're going to die and that you're going to hang, why even bother going through this clemency committee appeal at the end of the line anyway? This was their very last stop legally before they were going to be hung. And the two of them told this official Kansas committee, including the pardon and parole attorney at the time named Townsend. He was there too. They told them this, and it's in the notations of that committee that none of this stuff had ever been heard before. Why not? Why didn't it get heard? Why wasn't it noted? Briefly, I'll go ahead and read about 10 minutes of the going back to footprints found inside in cold blood, something that I first wrote back in March of 2015, and I went back through here about a month ago and made a couple of revisions to include some things in this article that I wanted to amend. Hickok letter number 4 to Nations. There is no date assigned to this 31-page letter. Quote, the rest of the day was uneventful as far as any mention of the Clutter murder was concerned. At one time during the day, I thought that people sure get shook up over things like that. I had read in the newspaper where the people of Finney County around Garden City had bought every padlock in town. I could picture a bunch of frantic people rushing to the stores, buying locks for their houses, and all the farmers sleeping with their shotguns by their beds. I thought it was funny. And here I was 400 miles away, and they were buying locks. I had to laugh about it. I'll stop on that quote from Dick Hickok to Mack Nations, because the entire time that Dick Hickok was up there at Lansing, until almost the final year in 1965, Dick Hickok told the classification people when he came back up there in 1960 to KSP to begin serving this death row sentence that he didn't know anything about this crime, he hadn't planned it, he wasn't involved in it, and he hadn't killed anybody. And he kept saying that over and over and over and over and over and over and over. Until 1965, when all of the appeals had been exhausted, both state Supreme Court and federal Supreme Court, and all of that was over with. Denied, 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 denied. Yeah, they would stay the execution. And when my father first met Hickok and Smith and the rest of those killers up there on death row in the winter of 1961, my father said that he thought that probably Hickok and Smith would be alive maybe 2.5 more years before they were hung, because that's about how long it usually took to run the course of the appeals that they legally were eligible to appeal for, but knowing that they had confessions on the crime and that this was a slam dunk, if you will, conviction, that's probably when they would be sentenced to die and actually have their execution carried out. This last quote that I just read to you is the mentality of Richard Hickok towards these victims, to other people who were terrified out there in western Kansas. This kind of stuff did not happen in Garden City, Kansas, in Finney, Kansas, or really any place else in Kansas. This was a very, very upsetting time for all the local people out there, and they couldn't figure out who would have done this or why they would have done this. And they began to look at one another, and everybody locked their doors. And this was something they had done before. We don't lock our door. I'm not afraid to come into the house and have the door open, and we come and go as we please. We're not worried about this kind of behavior or these type of things happening out here. We live out here in relative peace in the country, and we live our lives, and we raise our families, and we work hard, and that's kind of the mentality of 99% of the people out there in Finney County and the surrounding part of Kansas in the calendar year 1959, 1960. But things changed quite a bit due to this. I'm going to go ahead and conclude part 4 now, because my objective is to have people want to watch this, and I don't want to make these too long, and I'll continue the letters the next time on the 5th video.